The war was already over. The battlefield had gone quiet, not with relief, but with something heavier. Bodies lay where empires once stood confident. The wind moved freely now, where orders no longer mattered. Tomyris stood among the survivors, not welcomed by cheers, not lifted by triumph. Warriors lowered their eyes as she passed. Victory had arrived, but it brought no warmth with it. Cyrus the Great was dead. The most powerful ruler of his age had fallen. And yet, nothing felt won. Because Tomyris did not conquer an empire, she paid for it, with blood, with silence, with loss. So the question history avoids is not how she defeated him, but what power costs when the world is built to punish women who dare to wield it. Long before Tomyris ever faced Cyrus the Great, the world had already decided what power should look like. Across the ancient world, authority followed a familiar pattern. Kings ruled by bloodline, armies followed men. Law, land, and legacy moved through male hands. Women appeared in records as wives, mothers, prizes, or omens, but rarely as decision-makers. Power, when imagined, wore a masculine shape. This was not merely custom, it was belief. In the great empires of antiquity, rulership was framed as a natural extension of male order. A king was seen as the earthly reflection of cosmic balance, appointed by gods, reinforced by tradition, and justified by conquest. To challenge this structure was not just political defiance, it was disruption of what many believed the universe itself demanded. Within this worldview, female authority was not debated, it was dismissed. A woman who ruled was treated as a contradiction. At best, she was a temporary placeholder. At worst, a sign of disorder, something that required correction. History, written largely by men who served male rulers, absorbed this bias quietly and permanently. And yet, beyond the walls of cities and the reach of empires, there existed societies that did not organize power the same way. The Scythians were one of them. They did not build stone palaces or centralized capitals. Their wealth moved with them: herds, horses, families, weapons. Leadership among the Scythians was practical rather than ceremonial. Authority was tied to survival, loyalty, and the ability to protect the people. A leader ruled not from a throne, but from within the tribe. In this world, gender mattered far less than capability. Scythian women rode horses, they hunted, some fought. Their social roles were not equal in a modern sense, but they were not confined to silence or domestic invisibility. A woman who could command respect, negotiate alliances, and defend her people was not viewed as unnatural, she was viewed as necessary. This difference, quiet but profound, created two incompatible ideas of power. To the Persians, power was hierarchical. The king sat above all others, supported by bureaucracy, tribute, and divine justification. Lands were absorbed, cultures reorganized, and rulers replaced or subordinated. Empire was not only expansion, it was assimilation. To the Scythians, power was relational. A leader existed because the people followed. Authority could be lost if trust collapsed. Loyalty was personal, not institutional. There was no vast administrative machine to enforce obedience, only reputation, strength, and consensus. These systems did not merely differ, they contradicted each other. When Persian observers looked at Scythian society, they saw chaos, a people without cities, women who spoke freely, leaders who ruled without walls or crowns. To imperial eyes, this looked like absence of order rather than a different kind of order. And within that misinterpretation stood Tomyris. She did not rise as a rebellion against male authority. She did not seize power to make a statement. Her rule was not revolutionary, it was situational.
She became queen because she was positioned to lead and because her people accepted that leadership. This is where history often distorts her story. Later chroniclers would describe Tomyris as exceptional, a rare woman who overcame nature, tradition, and expectation. But that framing misunderstands her context. Tomyris was not an anomaly within her culture. She was an anomaly only within the records written by those who did not understand that culture. Among the Scythians, leadership followed bloodlines and alliances, but it was sustained through capability. When Tomyris assumed power, it was not perceived as a violation of order, it was continuity. Outside that world, however, perception shifted sharply. To the Persians, power represented vulnerability. If a woman governed, then her people must be weak. If her authority was accepted, then it could be manipulated. Marriage, diplomacy, or conquest could correct what empire viewed as imbalance. This belief would shape everything that followed. It is important to understand that Cyrus the Great did not initially see Tomyris as an equal adversary. He saw her as a political problem with an obvious solution. In his world, queens were absorbed into dynasties, not allowed to remain autonomous. A woman ruler was not a sovereign to be negotiated with, she was a gateway. History rarely pauses to examine how much of imperial ambition was built on such assumptions. Female authority was not simply resisted, it was misunderstood. When women ruled effectively, their leadership was attributed to manipulation, cruelty, or chance. When they ruled decisively, their actions were framed as excessive. The same behaviors celebrated by male rulers were condemned as unnatural when enacted by women. This double standard did not require explicit agreement. It functioned quietly, shaping how stories were told and preserved. Tomyris ruled at the intersection of these conflicting worldviews. To her people, she was a continuation of leadership. To the Persians, she was an obstacle. To historians writing generations later, she became a problem of interpretation. Was she a queen, a barbarian, a myth? The answer depended entirely on who was speaking. What we can say with certainty is this: Tomyris did not govern in a vacuum. She ruled in a world already predisposed to doubt her legitimacy. Her authority was questioned not because of her decisions, but because of her existence. And that skepticism shaped the way her story unfolded, and the way it would later be remembered. In imperial narratives, power that does not resemble empire is erased or reduced. Nomadic leaders become footnotes. Women become symbols rather than strategists. Complex societies are flattened into caricatures of savagery or simplicity. This is how history selects what endures. Tomyris was not remembered because she fit comfortably into ancient definitions of greatness. She was remembered because she disrupted them. And even then, her memory would be filtered through fear, fascination, and distortion. Before swords were drawn, before traps were set, before sons were lost, the conflict between Tomyris and Cyrus had already begun, quietly, ideologically, invisibly. It began with a question neither side spoke aloud. Who is allowed to rule, and who decides? And in a world built for men, Tomyris's very presence made that question impossible to ignore.
When Cyrus the Great turned his attention toward Tomyris, he did not begin with armies. He began with an offer. In the ancient world, royal marriage was not an expression of affection. It was a transaction, carefully worded, strategically timed, and designed to alter the balance of power without drawing a sword. To accept a royal marriage was to sign away something intangible but decisive: sovereignty. Cyrus understood this better than most. By the time he encountered the Scythians, he had already absorbed kingdoms through conquest and consent alike. Some fell beneath Persian cavalry. Others entered the empire through treaties, alliances, and bloodlines woven into the royal family. Marriage allowed Cyrus to claim legitimacy over lands he had not yet marched upon.
It was conquest without resistance. The language of such proposals was always deliberate. It spoke of unity, stability, shared rule. It promised protection. It implied honor. But beneath the surface, the meaning was unmistakable. One ruler would remain central, the other would be absorbed. For a male king, marriage to a foreign queen often expanded influence. For a ruling queen, marriage to an imperial king usually ended authority. Tomyris would have understood this immediately. The proposal offered by Cyrus did not treat her as an equal sovereign. It did not acknowledge her people as autonomous partners. It framed the union as beneficial precisely because it removed uncertainty. Persia would gain access to Scythian territory, resources, and strategic routes. Tomyris, in return, would gain security, defined by Persian terms. Security, in this context, meant supervision. Royal marriages in antiquity rarely preserved dual authority. They reorganized it. Children born of such unions were heirs to empires, not tribes. Allegiance shifted subtly, then permanently. Over time, the smaller polity ceased to exist as an independent entity. This was the logic Cyrus relied upon. From the Persian perspective, the offer was generous. Why spill blood when incorporation was possible? Why risk prolonged conflict when a woman ruler could be neutralized through alliance? The proposal did not acknowledge Tomyris as a threat. It dismissed her as a solution. That dismissal carried consequences. Tomyris did not reject the proposal because she distrusted Cyrus's character. She rejected it because she understood its function. Acceptance would not have preserved her rule. It would have dissolved it. Marriage, in this case, was not partnership. It was absorption. To agree would have meant allowing Persian influence to define succession, military command, and diplomacy. It would have placed Scythian autonomy beneath imperial oversight. Her people would no longer follow a queen of their choosing, but the extended shadow of a foreign throne. This was not an emotional decision. It was structural. History often frames Tomyris's refusal as defiance, an act of pride or stubbornness. But within her context, refusal was governance. It was the only choice that preserved the independence of her people. Cyrus, however, did not interpret the refusal this way. To him, the rejection signaled resistance. More than that, it suggested miscalculation. In imperial thinking, refusal meant either ignorance of consequences or an underestimation of power. Both were correctable. What followed was not immediate war, but escalation. Diplomatic language hardened, offers narrowed, alternatives were implied. The tone shifted from invitation to inevitability. In this progression, the original proposal revealed its true nature. It had never been optional. Royal marriage was simply the first method. It is important to note that Cyrus did not violate the norms of his world by making this offer. He acted within them. Marriage had long been used to bind, pacify, and annex. What made this situation unusual wasn't his strategy, but Tomyris's refusal. A woman declining imperial absorption disrupted expectations. In Persian ideology, legitimacy flowed downward from the great king to those beneath him. A queen who governed independently challenged that order by existing outside it. Her refusal did not merely block expansion, it questioned the assumption that expansion was inevitable. This is why the proposal matters. It was not a prelude to war, it was a test. Cyrus tested whether Tomyris could be neutralized without force. When she could not, the logic of empire demanded the next step. Not because she was cruel or arrogant or dangerous, but because she chose to remain sovereign. The distinction is crucial. Tomyris did not provoke conflict by insulting Cyrus. She provoked it by declining to disappear. In the ancient world, autonomy was tolerated only when it posed no challenge. The moment it resisted incorporation, it became an obstacle, and obstacles in imperial reasoning were meant to be removed. The proposal then functioned as a document of intent. It established terms, it defined expectations, it marked the moment where negotiation ended and inevitability began. By refusing, Tomyris forced Cyrus to abandon subtlety.
The path forward would no longer be framed in language of unity, but in terms of dominance and submission. What could not be absorbed would be confronted. Later historians would compress this moment into a single line: a queen rejects a king. But in reality, this was the quiet turning point, the moment when political strategy hardened into personal conflict. Not because love was scorned, but because sovereignty was defended. Tomyris did not mistake the offer for affection. She read it correctly, as an attempt to redefine her authority without asking her people. In rejecting it, she chose uncertainty over erasure. That choice would cost her more than power ever promised to return. Because empires rarely forgive those who expose their limits, and Cyrus, having failed to conquer Tomyris through words, would soon attempt to conquer her through something far more devastating.
A ruler may command armies, but lineage commands the future. For Tomyris, this truth was embodied in her son. He was not introduced to the world as a child, but as an heir. His existence was political before it was personal. Among the Scythians, succession was not merely inheritance, it was continuity. The survival of leadership depended on bloodlines trusted by the people and capable of command. As queen, Tomyris understood this clearly. She presented her son publicly as stability, as assurance, as proof that her rule did not end with her. In councils and negotiations, his presence reinforced legitimacy. He was the visible answer to the unspoken question every rival power asked: what happens when she is gone? But authority demands more than projection. Privately, Tomyris knew what his visibility invited. In the ancient world, children of rulers were never just heirs, they were pressure points. Their value lay not only in what they might become, but in what they could be used to force. Cyrus understood this as well as she did. To him, Tomyris's son was not simply a successor, he was leverage waiting to be applied. As long as conflict remained theoretical, letters exchanged, offers declined, intentions inferred, violence could be delayed. But once diplomacy failed, a calculus shifted. Direct confrontation was costly, manipulation was efficient. Cyrus did not move against Tomyris herself, he moved around her. This was not an act of cowardice, it was strategy. In imperial warfare, breaking a ruler's resolve often required bypassing the battlefield. Emotional vulnerability, when introduced carefully, could achieve what force could not. And no vulnerability was more universal or more dangerous than family. Publicly, Tomyris continued to rule with discipline. She prepared defenses, she evaluated Persian movements, she communicated strength to her people and restraint to her rivals. Her decisions reflected clarity and control. There was no record of hesitation in her commands. But privately, calculation gave way to awareness. She knew her son stood at the center of competing truths. He represented hope to her people. He represented opportunity to Cyrus. And between those interpretations lay a narrow margin of safety. This tension shaped every choice she made. To withdraw him from visibility would signal weakness. To keep him close would increase risk. To remove him entirely would fracture succession. There was no option without consequence. Ancient rulers often disguised such dilemmas beneath ritual and custom, but the reality was simple. Family bonds were exploitable precisely because they mattered. Cyrus exploited this ruthlessly. Rather than challenge Tomyris openly, he constructed a scenario designed to isolate her son. The specifics vary across historical accounts, but the pattern is consistent. Deception framed as hospitality, opportunity disguised as generosity. Feasts were not merely social events in antiquity, they were political theaters. Invitations signaled recognition, acceptance implied trust.
Within this context, restraint could be read as insult. Tomyris faced a choice. As queen, she recognized the danger. As mother, she recognized the inevitability. Refusing all engagement would escalate conflict prematurely. Allowing limited contact preserved the appearance of control. And so, calculated risk entered the space where certainty once stood. Her son was permitted to act independently, not because she underestimated Cyrus, but because denying him agency would undermine his future authority. A ruler in waiting who appeared sheltered would inspire doubt among allies. Here, public power collided with private fear. Tomyris did not act blindly. She assessed the risk as one would assess terrain before battle. But unlike land, human intent could not be fully mapped. Cyrus exploited that uncertainty. The trap, when it closed, did not rely on brute force. It relied on misjudgment layered atop trust. Wine flowed. Discipline loosened. Control dissolved not through violence, but through overconfidence. When the ambush came, it was swift. Tomyris learned of it not as a mother, but as a ruler receiving intelligence. Reports arrived fragmented, details conflicted. What remained clear was the outcome. Her son had been captured. At that moment, the separation between queen and mother collapsed. Publicly, she responded with restraint. There was no immediate retaliation, no rash command. Her authority required composure. Panic would only deepen vulnerability. Privately, the cost registered fully. In ancient politics, captivity was never neutral. A captured heir represented more than loss. It represented leverage actively in use. Cyrus now possessed what words and proposals had failed to secure. He had access to her limits. Tomyris attempted negotiation. This too was governance, not surrender. Appeals were sent, terms were explored. The goal was extraction, not appeasement. She sought to neutralize the leverage without conceding sovereignty. But Cyrus had no intention of returning what he had taken. The capture was not incidental, it was instrumental. The death of her son, whether by execution, despair, or manipulation, marked the moment strategy turned irreversible. The precise circumstances remained debated, but the effect was absolute. Tomyris did not receive a living heir back. She received finality. For the queen, this was a political rupture. Succession collapsed, continuity fractured. The future she had presented to her people vanished. For the mother, it was something else entirely. Yet even here, history records no public breakdown, no visible collapse. What followed was not chaos, but transformation. Grief did not render her erratic, it rendered her singular. The vulnerability Cyrus sought to exploit did not soften her resolve, it removed restraint. Where diplomacy once operated, it was now irrelevant. Where calculation once balanced options, it now yielded to certainty. The line between ruler and avenger did not blur, it hardened. Ancient rulers understood that emotional injury could radicalize power. Cyrus had gambled that Tomyris would yield to pressure. Instead, he had stripped away the last incentive for compromise. In attempting to control her through motherhood, he had eliminated the mother's reason to preserve anything beyond justice as she now defined it. The irony was profound. By weaponizing family, Cyrus had ensured that no future remained to bargain over. What followed would not be a contest of territory or treaties. It would be a reckoning shaped by loss that no victory could reverse. And Tomyris, once navigating power with balance and restraint, now ruled with something far more dangerous to empire than ambition. She ruled with nothing left to lose.
The news arrived as reports always do in war, fragmented, delayed, cautious. Her son, her heir, was gone. Not merely missing, not captured with the hope of exchange. Gone. The details were fragmented, veiled in the polite language of messengers. He has been taken. We could not intervene. It is certain. Words hovered in the air, incomplete, refusing to provide clarity, yet leaving no doubt. Tomyris did not collapse. The queen's composure did not shatter in the streets or in front of her council. There were no cries, no dramatic overturning of furniture, no speeches of wrath. She did not summon armies in panic. She listened, she recorded, she absorbed, each piece of information sharpening the reality. Each fragment confirmed what she already feared. What Cyrus had touched could not be returned. In the silence of her chamber, the weight of certainty pressed upon her. Not grief as the poets or storytellers imagine it, but recognition. Her world had shifted irrevocably. The political structures she had mastered, the careful balances of diplomacy, the measured presentation of strength, the subtle orchestration of loyalty had been stripped away by an act that was neither chaotic nor accidental. It was deliberate, strategic, inevitably cruel. This is the moment Tomyris broke. But she did not break as children do, or as the untested might. She broke as a ruler does, quietly, controlled, and with precision. The fracture was internal. It was a reconfiguration, not a collapse. Her mind, trained to weigh risk and outcome, understood that the loss of her son could not be allowed to dictate her actions in the immediacy. The governance of her people required continuity, and continuity demanded self-restraint. Yet within her, something fundamental had shifted. The part of her that negotiated, that weighed possibility against probability, that balanced fear against pragmatism, had hardened into singular purpose. Her son's death transformed the calculus of leadership. Before, she had ruled with a sense of preservation. Decisions sought not only to protect her people, but to sustain her lineage. Every action was measured for long-term stability. Every move considered the survival of both her tribe and her bloodline. That calculation had oriented her strategy for years. Now, with her heir removed and the future rendered uncertain, her strategy narrowed. There was no longer room for compromise. The possibility of negotiation had been removed by design, and with it the space for moderation. What remained was vengeance. Yet vengeance was not a spontaneous outburst. It did not erupt in fiery speeches or chaotic marches. It was methodical, calculated, inevitable. In the aftermath of loss, Tomyris observed the world differently. Every gesture of the Persians, every military move, every sign of complacency became subject to her scrutiny. Their pride, their underestimation of her capabilities, their assumption that a woman would break under grief, all became weapons to be used against them. The transformation from ruler to avenger was a process, not an event. It occurred in private moments, reviewing reports, considering the paths of armies, evaluating terrain, measuring loyalty among her warriors. Each act, though unremarkable in isolation, accumulated into a singular shift. Where once her decisions had been tempered by foresight, moderation, and the preservation of life, now they were guided by a single axis, the restoration of justice as she defined it for the son she had lost. Even her interaction with advisors changed. She no longer presented options for debate, she presented resolutions. Questions became subordinate to intent. Conversations were no longer explorations. They were confirmations of loyalty, alignment, and readiness. Her presence in councils carried weight, not merely because she ruled, but because the inevitability of her response to betrayal had become palpable. Within her own heart, grief remained, but it was no longer a private emotion. It had been transformed into resolve. Mourning in its traditional form was incompatible with the duties of command. She could not wail for her son, for to do so would signal weakness to those who watched.
Yet every strategic decision, every plan she set in motion, carried the weight of that grief transmuted into something tangible, the certainty that Cyrus would pay for what he had taken. The shift was also symbolic. Before this moment, Tomyris's authority had been recognized but also questioned. As a woman, her right to rule had always been under scrutiny, especially by external powers like Persia. Her decisions had been interpreted as cautious, her strategies debated as tentative. Now, in the wake of personal loss, hesitation was no longer permissible. Her decisiveness became absolute. Her judgment, once measured against the constraints of tradition, became an instrument of inexorable consequence. The psychological fracture was precise, almost surgical. It was not chaos, it was clarity. Grief, channeled into purpose, had removed any doubt, any hesitation, any possibility of compromise with Cyrus or his empire. The personal had merged with the political. Her son's death, initially an assault on her maternal identity, had become the catalyst for an unassailable political stance. The queen and the mother converged into a singular force, unyielding and unrelenting. She would not act from emotion, she would act from inevitability. This distinction mattered. In historical terms, the transformation preserved both her dignity and her strategic advantage. Had she been seen to rage, to act impulsively, to violate the calculated norms of leadership, she might have weakened her position before the empire she faced. Instead, by absorbing loss in silence, by allowing grief to sharpen rather than scatter her purpose, she ensured that when the moment of confrontation arrived, it would be met with the full weight of her authority, unmediated by distraction, sentiment, or fear. The Avenger had been born not from fire or fury, but from the disciplined acceptance of loss. And yet, even in this transformation, there was a subtle, almost invisible grief that lingered. It was expressed not in action, but in the quiet moments between orders, in the spaces where plans were drafted and decisions weighed. Every detail of the coming campaign, the timing, the placement of forces, the anticipated moves of Cyrus, was now intertwined with the personal loss she carried. History would remember the results, the battle, the death of kings. It would rarely, if ever, acknowledge the invisible engine driving her strategy, the private, irretrievable fracture of a mother's heart. Her warriors likely sensed the change, even if they did not understand it. Leaders transmit presence through subtle signals, the firmness of gaze, the economy of words, the exactitude of instruction. Tomyris's transformation radiated outward. No advice was required to interpret it. Her silence spoke with clarity. Those who had harmed her family, those who underestimated her, those who believed a queen would falter under grief, all would face the consequences of that misjudgment. It is here, in this intersection of loss and inevitability, that the legend begins to crystallize. Tomyris's moment of breaking is often misunderstood as sudden wrath. Ancient chroniclers interpreting from afar describe fury, outrage, and violent spectacle. Yet the historical reality is far more subtle and far more potent. The queen's fracture was controlled, deliberate, and irreversible. It was a quiet certainty that redefined every subsequent action, every decision, every engagement with Cyrus and his forces. The personal merged with the political. Motherhood became strategy. Grief became authority. Loss became purpose. In this controlled collapse, the seeds of revenge were sown. Every tactical consideration, every deployment of troops, every engagement that followed was now informed by the single variable that could not be calculated away: the death of her son. Nothing about this transformation was theatrical. Nothing about it was impulsive. It was a slow, inexorable conversion of grief into agency, of vulnerability into weapon. And when the confrontation with Cyrus finally arrived, she would act not because she had been provoked, but because she had been made inevitable. The moment Tomyris breaks is therefore not the collapse of leadership. It is the birth of a force history could scarcely comprehend,
a ruler whose every move carried the weight of personal loss and the certainty of retribution. By taking what was most precious, Cyrus did not weaken her, he sharpened her. And in sharpening her, he set the stage for a reckoning that would echo far beyond the battlefield, far beyond the moment, far beyond the memory of those who first witnessed it. Because power, when stripped to its essence, is defined not by victory, but by how one responds to the absence of what was once held dear. Tomyris responded with inevitability.
When Cyrus fell, the battlefield did not erupt with celebration. The Scythians did not cheer. They did not dance. They did not parade the head of a king as a trophy. There was no music, no song, no ritualized vindication. Only the quiet acknowledgement that the opponent who had inflicted the deepest wound on Tomyris, her son's death, had been removed from the world stage. Yet even in that silence, history insists upon embellishment. The story of the blood-filled sack is the most famous. According to Herodotus, Tomyris allegedly dipped Cyrus's head into a container of blood, declaring, "This is how the Persians drink their fill of the blood of the innocent." The tale has persisted for centuries, repeated as evidence of barbarity, of female wrath, of triumph tinged with cruelty. But the historical record is complex. Was the act literal? Perhaps. Accounts of warfare and ritual in the ancient world occasionally describe symbolic use of blood. Warriors did mark victories with offerings to gods. Leaders might perform ceremonies to honor the fallen, to assert divine approval, or to terrify enemies. The Scythians, a nomadic society with fluid ritual practices, could plausibly have engaged in acts that contemporaries misunderstood or intentionally exaggerated. Was it metaphorical? Very likely. Chroniclers often infused narrative with moral lessons. A queen who kills a king, a woman who defies empire, becomes a figure of didactic storytelling. The blood-filled sack could symbolize vengeance, the natural consequence of overreaching arrogance, or the moral imbalance restored after the death of her son. In this reading, the image is not literal but illustrative, a way to convey the magnitude of retribution to distant readers. Was it propaganda? Certainly. Persian and Greek writers alike had vested interests in portraying foreign cultures as savage. A woman exacting justice in a way that surpassed male norms disrupted expectation. Emphasizing cruelty in her victory allowed writers to frame her as monstrous rather than formidable, to preserve the image of male-dominated power structures as inherently natural. We may never know the truth. What is certain, however, is that Tomyris's victory carried a weight heavier than the battlefield itself. Cyrus was dead. The empire he had forged, stretching from Lydia to the edge of Mesopotamia, would endure, but his personal conquest against the Scythians had failed. Tomyris had achieved what very few rulers ever did. She defeated the architect of one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. Yet this triumph was not unqualified. Victory for Tomyris tasted like ash. The act of defeating Cyrus did not restore her son. It did not fill the gap in succession. It did not erase the betrayal, the exploitation, the grief that had reshaped her psyche. She had exercised agency in its purest form, strategic, decisive, absolute, but the cost was irrevocable. The life she had protected, the hope she had embodied for her people, had been extinguished. The triumph did not feel celebratory. It felt necessary, inescapable, final. Even as the Scythians prepared to move forward, even as word of Cyrus's death reached distant lands, there was no jubilation in Tomyris's expression. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She surveyed the aftermath as one surveys the result of a calculation, accurate, precise, but without comfort.
Her revenge had succeeded, but revenge in its fulfillment is a quiet teacher. It restores balance in the narrowest sense, but leaves the soul weighed down with the very knowledge that the act itself altered what it sought to correct. Ancient societies often encoded these lessons in narrative. Greek historians, writing from afar, emphasized the spectacular elements of her response, focusing on blood, terror, and the exceptional cruelty of a woman who had dared to confront a king. But within these accounts lies a recurring motif. Female power is extraordinary, morally charged, and disruptive to conventional order. Whether literal or symbolic, the stories reflect anxiety about the implications of a woman ruling with autonomy, enforcing justice, and surviving against male-dominated empires. This is why historians must tread carefully. When we hear of the blood ritual, we hear it filtered through centuries of interpretation. We hear the voice of chroniclers framing morality, gender, and empire. But we also hear something else, the quiet reality of strategic action by a ruler who had been tested to her limits, who had been pushed beyond the conventional boundaries of female leadership, and who responded with unflinching resolute. Cyrus's defeat, therefore, is inseparable from the moral ambiguity that defines Tomyris. She had exacted revenge, she had reclaimed honor, she had defended her sovereignty. Yet in doing so, she had crossed the threshold where personal loss and political necessity converged. Her victory was total, but it did not heal. It did not reconcile. It did not return what was lost. It was an act of justice, yes, but one that demanded a transformation in those who enacted it. The human cost of triumph is often measured not by the enemy's fall, but the way victory alters the victor. In Tomyris's case, the transformation was stark. Before, she balanced power with prudence, grief with calculation. Now, she ruled with clarity sharpened by personal loss. Every future decision, every interaction with allies, every potential threat from Persia was evaluated through the lens of that irreversible moment, her son's death and the demise of Cyrus. Her humanity, if it remained intact, was now intertwined with inexorable purpose. One could ask, did revenge restore balance, or did it hollow her? The answer is elusive. She had fulfilled her political and personal obligations simultaneously, yet history records her not as a reconciled figure, but as a symbol of wrath, of victory, of female defiance. She became both a cautionary tale and a legend. The act of revenge, necessary as it was not liberating in the emotional sense. It was a completion of duty, an execution of inevitability. The lesson encoded into these events resonates beyond the immediate conflict. In the ancient world, where rulers wielded life, death, and loyalty as tools, the boundary between morality and necessity was fluid. A woman executing authority in a society that expected her subjugation would inevitably attract judgment, myth, and exaggeration. Tomyris's actions, whether ritualized in myth, dramatized in narrative, or grounded in reality, illustrate the tension between personal agency and the cost of exercising it in a world that had predetermined the rules of power. The blood-filled container, therefore, real or symbolic, is less a historical fact and more a reflection of this tension. It is a marker, an allegory, a reminder that the assertion of authority by those marginalized or underestimated carries extraordinary weight, and that the stories told by later generations are often as revealing about the storytellers as they are about the events themselves. When we examine the aftermath, it is clear that Tomyris's victory reshaped perception, both near and far. Persia had been forced to reckon with a queen they could not absorb, a woman they could not manipulate. The Scythians had been preserved in their autonomy, their leadership reaffirmed, and their future safeguarded from immediate imperial domination. Yet the cost, the private, irreversible, and deeply personal cost, remains central to understanding the magnitude of her triumph. Victory, in this sense, was total but incomplete. It was moral and political, but not emotional. It restored balance in the narrowest sense. Sovereignty was preserved, honor reclaimed, the aggressor punished. Yet it did not restore what was lost, nor could it return the life of her son. It was an act of justice, yes, but one that bore the residue of grief, the shadow of what revenge always demands. Tomyris's story, therefore, is a paradox. She stands as a figure of power and determination, a ruler who faced the greatest empire of her time and survived. She demonstrates strategic acumen, emotional control, and relentless purpose. Yet she also embodies the human consequence of loss, the psychological residue of vengeance, and the complex moral terrain of triumph. Her victory tastes like ash because it reminds us that even the most complete conquest leaves its scars on those who wield it. In the end, the battlefield was silent once more. Cyrus was gone. Tomyris had acted. The people had survived. The empire had been resisted. And yet the queen's victory, like the ash...
History, as it is written, is rarely the story of the conquered or the independent. It is the story of those who prevail, who possess the means to record, to transmit, and to define significance. Tomyris defeated one of the most powerful men of her era. She preserved the sovereignty of her people. She enacted vengeance with precision. And yet, in the pages that survived, her memory fades, diminished and distorted, while Cyrus endures. His name is celebrated, his conquests remembered, his empire immortalized. She is recounted as a footnote, a barbarian, an anomaly. To understand why, we must examine the authors. Greek historians, such as Herodotus, provide the earliest accounts of Tomyris. They relay the narrative of her encounter with Cyrus, her refusal of his proposals, her son's death, and the supposed blood ritual that followed his demise. These accounts are compelling, vivid, and enduring, but they are not neutral. They are colored by cultural assumptions, narrative conventions, and ideological needs. To the Greeks, Persia represented both a threat and a fascination. Its kings were figures of grandeur and menace, its expansion a template of ambition to be admired and feared simultaneously. Women who exercised power were inherently strange in this worldview, particularly those who opposed men celebrated for empire building. By framing Tomyris as barbaric, as exceptional, or as cruel, these chroniclers could contain the narrative. A woman could strike down a king, but only by violating the norms of civilization. Her success became her transgression. In this framing, gender bias is inseparable from historical memory. A male king who kills his rivals, expands territory, and enforces sovereignty is a model of strategic genius. A woman who does the same is monstrous, excessive, or symbolic. The disparity is subtle yet pervasive. Where Cyrus's deeds reinforce the ideals of empire, Tomyris's deeds serve as cautionary tales about the dangers of female rule. Labeling her a barbarian achieved more than simplification. It controlled the narrative, guiding future readers to interpret her actions not as rational governance, but as wild emotion and excessive vengeance. The story emphasizes spectacle, the blood ritual, the vengeance for her son, not the sophisticated strategies she employed, the political calculations she navigated, or the cultural context in which she ruled. Her story was filtered through layers of bias. Each retelling reinforced the Greek perception of the other, the nomadic, foreign, and ultimately expendable.
A queen who resisted assimilation could not be celebrated. She could only be explained, excused, or diminished. Legends require distortion, and for women, distortion often reduces capability to myth. The more exceptional her accomplishments, the more her narrative must bend toward the extraordinary, the grotesque, or the unnatural. There is a further layer to consider: audience and utility. History serves the victors, certainly, but it also serves the curious, the literate, and the distant. For Greek audiences, Tomyris' story was entertaining, morally instructive, and strategically cautionary. She became a figure whose legend warned of the perils of pride, barbarism, and female power, not a queen whose political acumen merited equal consideration with the kings she opposed. This distortion contrasts sharply with Cyrus's immortalization. His achievements were preserved systematically, corroborated across multiple accounts, and aligned with the ideological frameworks of empires that endured after him. He became a template of kingship, decisive, expansive, inevitable. Tomyris's deeds, no matter how precise, did not fit the template, and so her memory was filtered, abridged, and reframed to emphasize spectacle over governance. The selective lens of history raises the question: who controls legacy? It is not the individual who acts, but the observer who records. Tomyris shaped events in profound, irreversible ways, yet the power to codify meaning lay elsewhere. Historians, scribes, and chroniclers chose which moments to emphasize, which moral lessons to extract, and which details to amplify. In doing so, they curated memory, constructing a narrative in which male authority is normative, female defiance is exceptional, and the moral universe remains comfortably patriarchal. The consequences are enduring. Across centuries, Tomyris has been remembered primarily through the lens of her opposition to a man whose fame has endured, not through the lens of her governance, her strategy, or her resilience. She is remembered for what she did to a king, not for how she protected a people. She is recounted in episodes of violence, not in analyses of leadership. She is mythologized, not historicized. Yet, within these distortions lies an opportunity to reinterpret. By examining the layers of authorship, bias, and intent, we can reconstruct a more nuanced understanding. Tomyris was not an anomaly in her own society, as the Scythians recognized. She was a ruler who navigated a complex political landscape with competence, intelligence, and resolve. She was a strategist, a tactician, and a leader whose decisions were shaped by the realities of warfare, diplomacy, and cultural expectation. In this light, the narrative of barbarism is revealed not as a reflection of her nature, but as a reflection of the assumptions of those who wrote about her. The moral and cultural frameworks of the chroniclers filtered her humanity, her agency, and her intellect into digestible symbols for audiences whose purpose was entertainment, instruction, or justification of patriarchal norms. The double standards are clear. Men conquer and are immortalized. Women resist and are reduced to legend. Men execute vengeance and are heroic. Women exact justice and are monstrous. Men shape empires. Women preserve them. Tomyris did both, yet history emphasizes the act, not the intelligence, the courage, or the leadership it required. Reflection demands that we confront another question. Why do we remember the stories we remember? Cyrus survives because empire, power, and conquest are celebrated within historical memory. His victories fit the narrative frameworks preserved by succeeding civilizations. Tomyris survives as myth because her story is disruptive. It challenges norms, complicates assumptions, and requires audiences to acknowledge competence, autonomy, and agency where they are least expected.
Legends are convenient, history is difficult. To preserve the idea of inevitability in male power, chroniclers transformed Tomyris from queen to cautionary figure, from strategist to symbol. And yet, despite centuries of marginalization, she persists. Her story endures not because of embellishment alone, but because the act of defiance resonates across time. She embodies the quiet, inexorable truth that leadership is not determined solely by recognition, but by action. She demonstrates that sovereignty, when exercised deliberately, cannot be erased, even if memory distorts it. In surviving in narrative, albeit misrepresented, she challenges the very frameworks that sought to contain her. This is the paradox of Tomyris, both forgotten and eternal, diminished and formidable. History remembers the framework around her, the spectacle, the moralized lessons, but not the totality of her power. Yet within those fragments, the echoes of strategy, of courage, and of sovereignty survive. They survive for those willing to read critically, to examine bias, and to question who is allowed to define greatness. We end then not with accusation, but with reflection. History is authored by those who observe, interpret, and record. The outcomes of deeds are inseparable from the narratives constructed about them. Powerful women like Tomyris reveal the selective nature of memory, the mechanisms of bias, and the fragility of legacy. They remind us that stories can both illuminate and obscure, that survival in memory is contingent, and that the truth of a life often exists in the space between chronicler and event. Cyrus survives as legend, empire, and example. Tomyris survives as myth, warning, and symbol. She was a queen who faced the impossible and wielded power in defiance of expectation. She was a mother, a strategist, and a ruler whose actions shaped history even if memory tried to contain her. And in this duality, she remains unmistakably